Hi, everyone. Welcome to Riot's Lunch and Learn series, the place where we feature all of Riot's partners. My name is Caroline Griffin. I am Riot's Director of Operations, and I'm super excited to have Rob Holt from iCertifi here with us today to talk about critical conformity challenges for IoT devices. Before Rob kicks us off, just a couple of quick reminders. This event is being recorded. It will be posted to Riot's YouTube channel and then shared via the meetup group where you signed up for this event. If you have any questions throughout the event, please do place those in the chat box and we will get to as many of them as possible at the end of the event. If for some reason we don't get to your question, we will connect you directly to Rob after the event. And to that end, please do keep yourself muted throughout the event. And then the last reminder is just the best way to view this presentation is in speaker view. That'll give you a nice big view of Rob's presentation and then a small view of him speaking in his beautiful library on the right. But without further ado, I will hand it over to Rob. Thank you all for being with us today.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Lunch and Learn webinar. The title is Critical Conformity Challenges for IoT Devices, both internally designed and own brand labeled. So the term internally designed, my inference is that you are making the device yourself. You're considered by most governments the manufacturer, even if you are just a designer and you have a contract manufacturer building something to your specs, you're considered the manufacturer, right? And then own brand labeled or OEM and companies who are going to take technology and then resell it, redistribute it, or import it in. I think some of this information is critical for you to know. Many governments, the European Union is one, as we're going to talk about today. Certain retailers like Amazon are getting caught up in some of that, where they're being forced to confirm a certain level of compliance documentation from the devices that they sell. So it's good for you to have an understanding of what the different topics are, the different disciplines are across the spectrum of regulatory requirements. But a little bit about iCertifi. We are, here we go. We are a conformity solutions firm, so we can handle your compliance needs from a concept all the way through to certification. So this involves, doing reviews at the concept level, prototype level. We can assist with managing the fulfillment of the formal testing, and all the way through to getting, base country grants like FCC, or help you with European declarations of conformity, and then beyond that, international approvals. We can help with program management, project management, and a lot of other services that are important to somebody who's going to be trying to launch a product. So let's just start with the problem that most startups have to deal with. And I want to just spend a little bit of time on this, since a lot of the companies within the Riot Consortium are startups. Most companies, when they first get started, have one of the founders or soon one of the principals involved with regulatory compliance, and not just regulatory compliance, but planning for, how do we manage our RMAs? What preparations do we have in case there is a product recall, or they should be planning for that, right? But regulatory compliance is something that a lot of executives will take on at the beginning, but eventually it becomes too much work, and they have to delegate that to someone else in the organization. And what I've seen in my 35 years is that you'll bring in an engineer who will be someone who specs in different parts. They'll work with the buyers to make sure the right parts are being ordered for the development of the product. Someone who does validation, someone who focuses on antenna designs, or is a design engineer. Sometimes as the company gets bigger, they'll have a technician. They'll either outsource or they'll have firmware people in-house to make sure that the software and the firmware is all validated. The problem is that a lot of times these people that I just mentioned in the last slide are also asked to manage regulatory compliance. And typically, and I've seen this probably 90% plus with the companies that I've served, um, it's not in the job description, but they're asked to manage it as well. And it can really stress them, because as you're going to see in this webinar today, it is a lot of work, a lot more work than most people realize. There's more tasks to do and documents to manage. And some of the problems that I've seen is that they're constantly trying to come up to speed. The people that are delegated to manage these compliance aspects are always coming up to speed with different disciplines. It's not something that they studied in school. Maybe they're electrical engineer, now they're having to do product safety, which in many cases is helpful, but they don't teach that kind of stuff in school. There's a lot of disciplines that they're going to have to learn along the way. Sometimes the providers that they're working with is offshore, so you're working odd hours with talking with either Taiwan or China, and they just get overwhelmed, and you start seeing mistakes because they've got too much on their plate. And in some cases, the company, someone will leave the company to find a job that is within their job description. So what I'm getting at is that, as a company grows, it's good to plan for and start to think about having somebody who is a dedicated compliance person. Obviously, at the beginning, this is not critical, but it is helpful to start thinking towards that. Because as you see in the slide here, there are many titles for somebody who fill a full-time role of providing the administrative conformity assurance, regulatory engineer, compliance clerk, compliance coordinator, compliance facilitator, compliance librarian, archivist, regulatory intelligence, which is very important, and / forecaster, keeping your finger on the pulse of new standards and new regulations that are coming and to plan for that. And here is a set of slides that I'm going to share that kind of help visualize how important this role of this person who will fill as a conformity assurance person, a compliance specialist, how important their role is, because it's a symbiotic hub between many different departments within an organization, within a company. Of course, EMC and product safety, and these that you see on the slide here rest typically with an engineering department, and usually the role of somebody in compliance is housed within the engineering department. My take is that it should be separate. It should be a separate entity that reports either to legal counsel or reports to the president or vice president. They should be divorced from being part of any one department, because as you're going to see, they serve all departments and they need things from these departments, and they need to provide things to people, stakeholders in these departments. So the first one is engineering and hardware. That's a given, since you're talking about principles of EMC and product safety. The next one would be operations. There's a number of specialties that you're going to see in this webinar that talk about reuse, recycle. We call that e-waste as well. That is something that is typically a post-launch effort, meaning after the products are launched. This is an ongoing maintenance, and so typically the budgets that pay for this effort come out of operations. But there has to be some involvement of the regulatory person regarding the ECO approval process. What happens when we have to swap out a part, which is a big deal nowadays with part shortages and chip shortages? What's the regulatory compliance consequences of swapping one device to another? What regulations apply to top level assemblies or accessories that operations is trying to source or acquire? The next one would be the QA department. I've typically seen them involved in the scrubbing of the bombs for RoHS and REACH. They house a lot of the top level documents that are involved with labeling, the user's manual, but also how do you manage these disparate documents, these disparate data sets of test data, reports, certificates, DOCs, So typically that's where you'll see a lot of the QA department, and also SSOPs, right? Those are typically housed within QA. Talking about the role, what the responsibilities are, what happens in these certain situations, like what happens with Kappa, right? That's all housed under QA. Of course, there's finance. There's a lot of work that a regulatory person has to deal with the finance department in terms of obtaining quotes, requesting POs, managing and logging the third parties, the consultants in the labs, confirming the validity of the invoices from the labs, collaborating on budgets, regulatory budgets and associated type budgets. There's a lot of work with finance. Legal. Contracts needs to be flushed and vetted. Statements of work, NDAs, service agreements. That's all is very essential. Of course, if they're publicly traded, there's a sourcing requirement now through the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, for the 3T and G. And so if you're publicly traded, that's something that legal counsel needs from the compliance person, the CMRT report, so they can include that in their SD filing. Europe also has a sourcing standard coming into effect soon. And so this is becoming a big deal of sourcing. There's other US requirements that just came into effect this year about sourcing in regards to social responsibility. So it's becoming a bigger thing now with ESG. Sales and marketing, of course, sales needs to know what the budget's going to be for a compliance launch in a certain country. So they go to the regulatory compliance person to help budget for that. What's the consequences of coming out with the CIP version? What extra testing, if any, do they need to do for adding a certain feature? OEM oversight. So a lot of salespeople will buy an accessory, or they want to add a certain device in their ecosystem. Well, they need to make sure that that device, that accessory is fully compliant, and that their documentation has been fully scrubbed before they make the deal. Software and firmware, as you'll see in this later in this slide, when it comes to wireless devices, in many countries around the world have their own unique flavors in terms of frequency allocation, channel spacing, the power levels in those channels. A lot of that, if not most, all of it is driven by firmware. So there's a lot of symbiosis for regulatory, but also for market-driven standards like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth SIG. A lot of these efforts to get passing data to be able to declare those market-driven standards have to involve working with firmware departments. Sourcing department, the people who are buying need direction as to make sure they're buying the right parts. Not only that is it RoHS or REACH compliant, but does it, for product safety, are the critical components recognized? The ones that should be recognized, are they recognized? And so the sourcing won't know. This is something that has to come from the regulatory compliance person. And logistics department, right? There's going to be documents that logistics need to make sure that the right declarations are going into the right countries. Are the HS codes correct for that given country? Declaration for testing purposes, meaning if you're going to ship into China or to Taiwan for testing, do you have the right phrasing so you don't have to pay import duties? You're just shipping it in there for testing, and it's going to be coming back. Logistics needs to look to you to make sure that all of that is correct. And so that's a lot, but here I've went ahead and put together a slide that helps you visualize some of the top level disciplines involved in launching a product like an IoT device. EMC, which you could also add RF as part of EMC, product safety, environmental simulation, substances of high concern, and reuse, recycle, as well as energy efficiency for some devices. That's important. So let's kind of take a quick but deeper dive into each of these disciplines. So the way I like to talk about at the picture concept level is, if you have a toaster and it plugs into the wall, into an electrical socket, that's an electrical device. There are product safety standards that apply. In some cases, in the US, it does not apply to residential or domestic environments. It has to do with companies who are providing electronic devices or electrical devices to their employees must spec a device that is NRTL approved. So that's electrical. Typically, those will be considered, product safety. But then if you add a chip to the toaster to make it such that the fancy display is serving a purpose for the end user, then it becomes a electronic device. Now for IoT, as soon as you add a radio to that so that it can talk to the gateway, now it's a radio device as well. It's all three. So for EMI EMC, the first section, before you've added the radio, if you're just talking about adding a chip to the device and becomes electronic, you're going to have to pass what are called unintentional or digital device portion testing. This would be listening to the device to document that it is below a certain propensity to interfere with other nearby devices. So the base countries that you could do one suite of tests for and cover would be US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and the EU for the EMI portion where you're listening for the radiated emissions and the conducted emissions coming down the line. Now, EMI, when we're going back to that toaster analogy, there could be incidental noise coming down that line into other parts of the electrical system of that part of the house or on that circuit. And so there is a section called Part 18 that does talk about incidental emission, potential for emission interference. But when you're talking about going in the inverse, where you're talking about doing something to the device, that is something that to this point is typically a European requirement. The FDA has adopted some immunity type tests for some of their requirements, but for Europe, we're talking about radiated and conducted immunity, which is the inverse of radiated and conducted emissions. Radiated and conducted emissions, we're listening for the device to see the radiation coming off. With radiated and conducted immunity, we're seeing how the device can handle a certain level of volts per meter and frequency. Can it still operate as intended in that phenomena? There's electrostatic discharge, there's low level surges and EFTs, there's voltage dips, in some cases, if it applies, magnetic. And then we get to the radio part, the fun part for IoT devices. In the US and Canada, it requires a TCB issue a grant. The FCC got out of this business a long time ago, probably 10 years ago plus, and they have empowered entities that if they pass the audit and meet other criteria are the ones that will issue grants. And they typically, most TCBs are empowered to offer issue grants for both US and Canada. There is a modular approval program in the US and Canada is such that if you buy a pre-approved module, and if you follow the conditions of applicability, you won't have to reproduce the majority or any of the testing. You can then stand on that module's FCC ID. You would use that module's FCC ID on your label instead of getting one for yourself. There are other countries that are similar, but they require in-country testing. Those would be Mexico, Brazil, and China. But they don't have a modular approval program per se. They want to be able to see the testing. Let me see. Another one that's kind of related to the radio is SAR, and this is a big one for a lot of IoT devices that are body worn. You have to be able to test and document that the absorption rate of the radiation from the device is below a certain threshold to human tissue. For low powered devices, there is a calculative way to demonstrate that it's below a certain propensity for harm, but human or animal harm. But you have to run that calculation to be able to exempt yourself from actual testing. Getting into product safety now, there are three main buckets, as you see here. North America, European Union, and then international. In North America, we have what it's called the National Recognized Test Laboratory Program. It is managed by OSHA, which means if you're a test lab and want to become an NRTL, you have to submit to an OSHA audit. As you see in the CSA example here, the letters on the outside of the circle, C stands for Canada, US stands for US. So if you only see a US with an NRTL mark, that means the Canada deviations were not covered. And likewise, if you see a C without a US, it means the US variations were not covered. But there are 17 or now 18 NRTLs in the country. Each of them have as much legal standing as the other. Some people think UL is the only game in town, but it's not true. Every NRTL has as much legal standing. In the European Union, it is a part of a directive, which means it's part of CE marking. And if you're within the ranges of applicability, you must, demonstrate that the product is safe for the given end use environment. And of course, there's different standards based on the different end use environments in Europe. But there's no formal program like there is with NRTL. With NRTL, you're licensing that mark. You have to pay an annual licensing fee. You're going to have an initial factory inspection. You're going to have quarterly, or at the very least biannual factory inspections of where the device is being housed. If you make changes to the device, you have to open the report and update it and then pay for that report revision. Whereas the European Union, it's kind of one and done. You're able to declare conformity and you just self-declare. The IEC-CB scheme is a formal report, but it doesn't have any factory inspections. You're not licensing anything like a mark. There's no mark you put on the product, but it is a very efficient scheme. There's up to 52 member nations. It's been around, a little over 30 years. And with one suite of tests, you can cover, if you really wanted to, all 52 deviations. Of course, if you're only selling to 10, you're going to have your test lab, if they're an NRTL/CB, tested just those countries. And one thing that's unique, as you'll see in my note here at the bottom, these are all based off the same base standard. So typically you'll see like a 62638 UL/ANSI standard. You will see an EN 62638 and an IEC 62638. They're all kind of based on the same approach, but with deviations for that market. There's some standards out there that will call out some mechanical tests to be provided, ingress protection being one. And some of you might be aware of different IP ratings like IP65, IP67 that has to do with the water ingress or dust ingress. There's vibration and shock. These are profiles that are applied to the device. There could be transportation profiles, et cetera, to see how your device holds up. Temperature cycling, there's drops. You could have temperature cycling that involves just temperature, but you could have humidity and temperature swings to see how your device holds up. Substances of high concern. This has been around a long time, RoHS, where there's up to 10 now banned substances. And there is a RoHS 3, and in RoHS 2, it became part of CE marking. It is a harmonized standard. REACH is not harmonized. It has been something that is managed differently by each of the 27 member nations. Just a little bit different flavor in each of them. And the unique thing about our industry is that if you're going to open up a bomb and scrub it for RoHS, which is required for CE marking, you might as well just do REACH at the same time. It saves time. But it's not part of CE marking. REACH is managed individually. Companies like iCertifi can help you, differentiate which is the common denominator approach for all of the countries you're going to ship into. But the bottom line is the REACH has a minimum threshold for each of these 223 substances. And the hard part about REACH is that every 6 months, the European Union can add more substances to the list. So you're never really done. With RoHS, you could say, I'm done. I scrubbed my balm. I do not have any of those 10 banned substances. But with REACH, every time they issue new substances, you have to kind of re-scrub your balm and see if any of those new substances are in your balm and address it at that time. California is California Prop 65. That's over 700 substances. But there are different ways to manage that. The best way is testing at a toxicology lab and get a toxicologist to issue a safe harbor report. But there are other ways through declarations to kind of skirt that. And a lot of it has to do with how high of a risk is your product type. If it's like a remote control for a set-top box, that's high risk. They're going to be the end user is going to be touching and using it a lot. But the set-top box is sitting on, near the TV. It gets touched maybe once every couple of months when they're dusting, or maybe once a month. So it's a lower risk is what I'm saying. I have a note here on the Eurasia block, and that is because Eurasia and UAE and Saudi Arabia, they're asking now for more evidence of how was you concluded that you were in conformity with RoHS. In Europe, there's really nobody looking over your shoulder unless they have reason to start asking for it. But for you to get a type approval, as we're going to be talking about here shortly, the Russia bloc and a couple of countries in the Middle East are now asking you to come up with what's called the risk assessment, where you're going to tell the story of how it was that you arrived at conformity. And if you say, I just gathered DOCs from my clients and I'm going to stand on that, that's not going to fly. What these authorities are asking for is that you had an assessment of high risk versus low risk. And for some of the high risk parts, you've got actual passing test data from your part supplier. So it's becoming more of a delicate thing now, or a more detailed thing, I should say. In the European Union, there's an e-waste that's been around a long time. It is not harmonized. It is managed slightly differently in the 27 member nations. There is a pan-European approach that you can take to be in conformity with as many countries as you ship into Europe. If you ship into all 27, there's still a pan-European approach that can be employed. But it requires you to provide ways for your customers, whether it become end of life or RMA issues. How do they get the products back to you as the manufacturer, or through your registering of a producer scheme in that country, which is a fancy word of saying a recycling network that they can take the device to. And you have to manage the products that come back to you, and they go through the recycling scheme. You'll get an annual report from the recycling scheme for every device that's been returned to them, and you can combine those two numbers and see if you hit the target, which is 65% reuse recycle. There are more countries around the world, and even within the European Union. I mentioned it's not harmonized, so it's also enforced differently within each country. And Germany and Ireland seem to be the biggest issuers of fines and penalties regarding REACH noncompliance. WE non-compliance. But India just went online last year with their e-waste requirement, as did Oregon and Maine. And there's more states that are looking to vote this year on adding e-waste to their requirements for their states. So it's becoming a larger thing to prepare for. If your device goes into a hazardous location, there are schemes. It's very similar to the general product safety that I was talking about before, the three main buckets: North America, Europe, and international. And it's also part of IEC, just like the previous product safety slide I was talking about. But this is a way to demonstrate that your product is safe within a given hazardous environment. If you've got questions on that, we can help you in the right direction. But it's something to consider if your products are being sold to areas that are considered hazardous. Another thing as like a whole standalone issue to deal with as for the regulatory point person on your company's team is labeling. So you can see in this guide here, and this is not all the marks. This is probably this adapter that I pulled, probably missing a few. I don't see Kyrgyzstan, but you can see it's pretty in depth, and there's only so much real estate on the back of a label, but it takes someone on your team to really ensure that the marks that need to be applied are applied, and they're applied appropriately with a certain size requirements, in the ratio of the label. There's a lot that goes into just making sure that your labeling is accurate. They do have workarounds for small products, but the best workaround is if it has a display, and within a few steps, the end user can get to the regulatory documentation statements within the device's display. User's guide is another thing that can be as a task unto itself, making sure that the user's guide has the right regulatory sections, that the right regulatory section calls out the right phrasings for the right countries, which countries require an actual translation into their national language. In some of those cases, it doesn't have to be the full manual. It could be a certain insert, or it could be an abbreviated manual. But the minimum includes any warnings that would typically be in a manual need to be translated, and setup instructions. So a lot of companies for that will create an insert in that country's national language. Type approval certificate. So this has to do with radio-based devices, and of course, most Internet of Things devices are going to be either a pre-approved module or their own, hybrid module. And in the US, you have a grant that's issued. In Canada, you have a grant that is issued. That means it's like a license to broadcast. In Europe, you don't have any program or anyone looking over your shoulder. It's all self-declarative. But if you're going to go on to other countries around the world, they're going to require that you meet a certain level of evidence and due diligence before they will issue you what's called a type approval. It's the same thing as a grant. It's your license to broadcast in that country. I kind of referred to this in one of the previous slides, but each country has their own specific frequency allocation in many cases that is unique to either that country or that region. Certain countries in APAC might share the same frequency allocation. There are certain channels that are restricted that you're only operate to use in certain channels. And you may have power levels within those channels. And there are other countries that sometimes will ask for FHSS or other frequency hopping methodologies to be employed and shown to have meet those radar avoidance, especially in the 5 gig range. There's certain countries that require certain extra things to be provided to them before they issue you a type approval. Another thing to keep in mind is that a harmonized tariff code is very important. It will, in many cases, that designation, that code will indicate what radio standards, what product safety standards must be met in that country, which ones you might be exempt from. So HS codes are something that is not just for the logistics department, but it also plays a big part in your type approval approach, in terms of making sure you've got the right scope, that before you start any testing or submittals, you want to make sure that your HS code is accurate for the country intended, because that is going to be something that's going to affect the final certification or the final certificate. And if it's the wrong HS code and that gets becomes an issue later, there may be additional cost to redo the certificate later. So let me just give you a quick overview of this of what a system can be considered, and how nowadays it's not just about the core device. So it could be a system of many different devices, right? That together serve a certain purpose. In this case here, this is a body-worn, mesh-enabled, voice-activated device here, typically worn on a lanyard or is clipped in the pocket lapel. And the picture you're seeing here is the core device. It's a radio. It's a slave, but still it communicates with the gateway via Wi-Fi 2.4 and 5. But of course, to power the device, it needs a battery, and the battery needs a battery charger, and the battery charger needs an AC adapter. All of which has some overlap, but also some unique testing and certification requirements for that. So for the core device, you're looking at, as I mentioned in one of the previous slides, you've got EMI, EMC, RF testing, possibly SAR, or at least the calculation to show that it's below the threshold for harm. Product safety, substance of high concern, which is e-waste. But on the battery, you're gonna have the same. You're gonna need an unintentional EMC. You're gonna need battery testing for transportation, the UN 38.1. There's going to be product safety performed on the cell and then on the pack. If you're a manufacturer of an IoT device and you're going to buy a battery, you need to make sure that it has the UL/ANSI standard for both cell and pack covered. And then you're going to roll that into your NRTL. And the NRTL is going to be looking for your cell and pack reports. Substance of high concern. This one especially because this is a body-worn device. So this actually, if the nurse or the user has an open blouse, this could be sitting on the skin all day long. So if there's phthalates in here, that could be a problem, right? But there's also for the battery. There may be validation testing needed for the core and the charger. For the actual charger, you've got unintentional EMC, as we mentioned on the last two slides, product safety. But then you've got things that are unique, like energy efficiency, BCS testing, which stands for battery charging system, which is the charger and the adapter together. And then here in the United States, CEC requires that you upload that energy efficiency data and register with their site. You still need RoHS Reach for Europe and Then you've got the AC adapter. Again, unintentional EMC, product safety, energy efficiency. Now this is for an external power supply. And the slide here says CEC registration, but for the EPS, that would be Canada, NRCan, and Australia E3, where they want to see the EPS data and registration. You're also going to need RoHS and Reach, and you're going to need WE. Then you've got miscellaneous parts of this system. The lanyard still has to meet RoHS and California Prop 65. The labeling, there's packaging directive for the system being shipped. It just goes on and on. Now, for body-worn devices, this is something that I've been involved with for these types of devices in the past, and that's telemetry testing. The University of Georgia, the Georgia Research Technical Institute, is the top provider of telemetry testing. It's for people who have pacemakers and they want to use this device. Is this device going to be demonstrated that it's safe to be operated within a certain distance between the pacemaker and the device? There's no regulatory there, but it's definitely for providing assurances to your clients' users. I mentioned this kind of earlier. Conflict Minerals is a sourcing of 3T&G for the SD filings with this SEC. So that's a whole sourcing discipline unto itself. Now, regarding shipping products into these countries with type approvals, many of those will be tied to you having an actual local representative or local holder. Sometimes it could just be a cert holder. Sometimes registration is actually required. Sometimes it has to be a designated representative who is legally responsible. And so every country is different. Every country, you have to look at what are the authorized rep requirements for that country. Yes, my firm can provide in-country reps or local holders throughout the world. In Europe, July of last year, the new market surveillance regulation kicked in. And so that is now in effect, and it requires that you have a designated authorized rep within the 27 nations within the European Union. The DOC, the new format for DOC has been changed, and it allows certain areas that comply with this regulation that needs to be included in the DOC. It also carries obligations, and not just to the manufacturer, but all economic operators in the supply chain, which should be importers, distributors, and line of, so the suppliers that provide the product to the end users. That's, I mentioned earlier, Amazon, they get caught up in this requirement. They have requirements to do a certain level of due diligence to make sure that the products that they're selling have had their compliance documentation looked at, and it can be verified to a certain degree. Similarly, the UKCA, which was supposed to have come into effect last month, but they punted the ball and they pushed it out to January 1st of next year. That is for Scotland, Wales, and Great Britain proper as part of the United Kingdom. So there's a market requirement coming. There's a new DOC. There's also an authorized representative designation requirement similar to the European one I just discussed. So it means you must have a legal representative in the United Kingdom who's legally responsible for your product. In both the European slide, the new market surveillance regulation, and in UKCA, they both share a 10-year term, meaning whoever is designated as your legal rep must hold that technical file for up to 10 years. If it's medical, it's 15. And then moving on to cybersecurity, that is becoming a thing now, and it seems to be a thing for IoT, right? How do you protect against the vulnerability of your device being accessed? What privacy policies, what protections can you design into your device that will help keep you private? If it's a medical device or something that's used in a medical environment, what happens with HIPAA if it's found that there wasn't a full level of due diligence? There could have been some things you could have mitigated, but you didn't. How does that affect your liability, possibly from the federal government, right? Who's liable if the sensors or communications malfunction? A lot to deal with just on that one slide. There is a new cybersecurity standard coming. I called out the names here. It's still still on the tracks. It hasn't arrived at the station yet. It hasn't been published fully, but they're giving us the indication that by 2024, there will be a cybersecurity requirement added to RED. RED stands for the Radio Equipment Directive, which is the equivalent of you obtaining an FCC grant for broadcasting. In Europe, and maybe I didn't mention this so far, in Europe, when you talk about CE marking, you're declaring, when you put CE mark on the product or on your pack, and or you're required to put on the packaging, the outside package, when you ship, you're declaring that you've met every directive that applies. So I mentioned low voltage directive earlier. There's an EMC directive for the unintentional side of your device. There's the RF directive, which is titled the Radio Equipment Directive. And there's a number of different things they're looking for when you have multiple reports under the RED directive to demonstrate conformity. Soon it will have cybersecurity in just about a year and a half or so. The FTC, they are taking enforcement pretty seriously in terms of truth in advertising. when you say you can manage a certain level of data security, can it really? So there's a lot of claims that are being monitored now by the FTC. There's the FDA, for they regulate medical devices. So what there are standards that they're looking for to see, what levels of protection you have from hacking into to medical devices. And of course, it depends on the type of device. Is it giving treatment versus therapy versus monitoring? Is it mobile? Is it software as a device? There's different levels there, but it's something to be considering if you're going to be selling into that market. There's others, right? Driverless drones, NISTA for driverless cars, the energy department for smart grid technologies. There's certain things that they want to see. The EPA regarding network sensors that monitor pollutants, they have requirements. NIST, so IoT is kind of changing a lot of things, and there's a lot of agencies that it has for certain things that could be considered very tiny slices within the spectrum, but they're all something that you as the IoT manufacturer need to look at and consider and count your cost and make sure you're designing towards that. Retail. So we're seeing, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, the new market surveillance regulation, but also for other reasons, there are compliance departments now popping up in Walmart, Amazon, they're at Costco. They're asking for compliance, some of which you've already met by doing regulatory, others go beyond regulatory, which means you don't have to meet it, but if you want to sell through them, you're going to need to. So, before you start finishing the design of your product, you might want to reach out to the retailers that you're want to sell to and find out what the requirements are to make sure you're building to that. That's a lot. That is a lot of planning and testing. And at the end of the day, when you actually pass all of the tests that I've mentioned, all the different requirements and agencies, there's documents, there's pre-validation, pre-certification documents, formal documents for finals of formal testing. There's going to be reports and certificates and declarations, and it's a lot. Somebody, you need to archive it efficiently. You need to be able to deliver it. If somebody says, "Hey, I need this this one report for this one discipline on this one device," is it easily accessible and ready to deliver? Something to also keep in mind as you're preparing all these documents, make sure that the model names and numbers match across all documents. Some countries don't allow for X and Y variables. So you must list them all out separately, which is not fun. Some countries do allow for families, but it has to be justified a certain way in certain countries. Sometimes those families are more geared towards product safety, the critical components of the device, the power distribution side. What similarities justify family versus EMC, the similarities of chips, the processors. At a certain point, the deviation of chipsets will cause it to be a different, not justified as a family. RF obviously would have to do with is it the same module? Does it have the same antennas, etc.? Now, this is something I've seen people don't really watch out for, but you must, because I've had rejections based on the company not having the right dash in their name. That there was a section of their corporate name that had a hyphen in it. So it's important to always keep everything the same across all of your regulatory documents. And you can save time by utilizing regulatory part numbers. Instead of using just your core model names, you can cover a bunch of different variations by adding, the dash X's or Y's. And there could be software changes. It could be the accessories included, the color of the device. That one mesh-enabled radio is showing me that's white, but there's also a black version. It's the same unit, but the company had to have a separate SKU for that, right? But for regulatory, it's the same device. So you can use regulatory part numbers to reduce your number of certificates And so that's something you need to be cognizant of, and I can help you with that if you need to come up with the right regulatory part approach. Serialization versus parallel in terms of testing disparate disciplines at different labs. If you really want to launch a product fast, there are ways to consider which can be done in parallel, which has to be done serially. Take some planning and make sure that there's the high risk tests you want to get out of the way first, but that can also speed up your time to market by months if you come up with the right test plan for all of your different disciplines. As a general rule, excuse me, always do EMC first. And one area that we see that has the highest failure is going to be your radiated emissions. That's the energy coming out of your box, your device. The second would be ESD. And then your RF spurious, and then your product safety construction requirements. So on the product safety construction requirements, number 4, there's a typo there, should have been number 4. You want to make sure that you have a copy of the standard and you're designing your product to meet those construction requirements. Or in the case of a risk, hazard-based, making sure you're designing to the construction requirements or to the risks. Those are the top 4 areas of failure that we've seen over the last couple of decades. So we suggest having a red flag EMC design review at the concept stage, and then of course a material and construction product safety pre-assessment performed, either at concept level or prototype level. So that could typically involve hiring a consultant or a lab. There are some safety checks that you can run. Some are automated through different software packages you could buy. But a lot of these checks here are helping you prepare for EMC to make sure that you're not going to have a gotcha later. So what I'm saying is the more level of designing and validation you can do at the front end saves you a lot of time in a debug situation where the house is on fire and everybody's upset. It's better to do it plan ahead. So here is a section of some best practices that we've seen that are common. I won't read all of them, but this recording will be on YouTube, so you can kind of watch it, read it later. These are some good rule of thumbs to keep in mind when you're designing a product. And so then it also helps to have your foremost test regimen already mapped out before you get to that phase, so that you can save time. If you do everything, as I mentioned a few slides ago, serially, you could be looking at many weeks wasted. Partly because if you finish one discipline and then you call the lab and say, okay, I'm ready for the next discipline, they may have a lead time of 2 weeks. They can't get you started for another 2 weeks. Well, that's just the 2 weeks wasted. Many of these will have maybe a 48-hour or worse, 72-hour cancellation policy. So what I'm saying here on your plan is you can set up scheduling such that if you have to cancel, you can cancel. But if you pass those steps leading up to the next test, you could just jump right in. So there needs, you can put some thought into this and have a plan ready to go that can save you days and weeks. Some good takeaways. It's very important to centralize your compliance data and your evidence documentation in a single view. What I'm saying here is have some kind of regulatory dashboard. Some people use Agilent. For those out there who use Arena Solutions, they have a great tool called the Compliance Manager module. You need some way, SharePoint if you have to, but SharePoint is not that great. But you need to have a way that uninitiated people in your organization can go by either by discipline or by country and find the certificates that they're needing in a very timely manner. A lot of these documents will be changing over time as you have a customer improvement version come out, or you have to swap out components, or you want to add a second source. So these documents are updated. How do you know that that second report is the formal second report and not a draft report? So there has to be some, excuse me, QMS or best practices utilized, and that's what this document is calling out here. iCertifi has a certificate repository tool called iVault that helps meet these three bullets here. But there are other solutions out there, but you need to definitely not lean on C drives, SharePoint. Find a way to put together a way of managing your documentation that is efficient over time. And have workflows for documentation types as you go. Have a siloed, decoupled repository. When I say decoupled, we have seen hack attacks. What do you call those? Ransomware, where when they trying to hold hostage the company data, if your regulatory compliance data is captured in that, you can't get to it. That's not a good thing. So when I say number 3, have a siloed or decoupled repository, that's important to have some type of a decoupled repository for your high-level certifications, like the iCertifi's iVault system, that prevents a ransomware being successful because you've already set your certification documents off to the side. Change request, revision control, and obsolescence processes are very important, as well as making sure that whatever system that you utilize for managing the top level type approvals, or the US grant or the Canadian grant, many of these countries are only good for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. So like the iVault system with iCertifi has a way of letting you know, as the manufacturer, whoever your point person is, or it could be shared to multiple people in the organization, hey, this one certificate in Brazil is coming up in 90 days. They send another notice at 60 days. Hello, you got 60 days to update this certificate, 30 days, and then we'll contact you to give you a final heads up that do you want to renew it, or are you going to let it lapse? And that's very important. The worst thing you want to do is to be shipping into a country and then be told that your certificate is no longer valid. That's not fun. So I think I'm pretty much done, and I am. So hopefully that was helpful. I'm known for oversharing, but hopefully for those of you who are new to this, that was very educational, and I hope that it'll help you as you plan for your product launches.
Thank you so much, Rob. Great presentation. A lot of great comments on just how the presentation was wonderful. I don't see any questions though, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask Rob directly, or if you're more comfortable, you can put those in the chat box. Rob, thanks for providing your contact information. As a reminder, this was recorded. It'll be posted to Riot's YouTube channel and then shared out via the meetup page where you registered. And I do encourage you to reach out to Rob directly with any questions. As always, you can reach out to me as well, Caroline@riot.org. And we look forward to having Rob back at the virtual Lunch and Learn session later this year. He's always got some great topics. So I'm not seeing any questions, so I guess we'll close it out. Rob, thanks as always for the wonderful presentation, and thank you to everyone for joining. Take care, everyone.